Welcome to our first panel. What seems like we had panels last year, but they were all virtual. So our first in-person panel in almost a year and a half, which is wonderful. Politics 101. A few announcements before we dive into tonight's discussion about sort of the role of politics in our panelists' specific area of work. For both 395 and 395 research interns, just keep in mind your first political event is due on October 8th by 5 o'clock. You're going to upload your memo write-ups on Blackboard, so just be mindful of that deadline. If you have any questions about any aspect of that write-up, please let me know. They do need to be live events. I'm pushing back against virtual events because we were virtual for a long time and I don't think anyone really enjoyed it all that much. So I really want you to be in an in-person event. It's fine if it's also being live streamed like this, but we want you to actually be there. For 395 students, I'm currently doing my one-on-one meetings and have met with probably 2/3 of the class. If you haven't signed up, please make sure to sign up. If there are no spots available, email me and we'll find a time to meet with you. But we do need to get those one-on-ones taken care of. And in that regard, 395, your research proposals are due a week from Friday. So just be aware that those deadlines are coming up. Just be aware that that assignment needs to come in by 5 o'clock on that day. All right, with no further ado, I'm going to do some brief introductions just to give you a sense of who our panelists are here today. And then my plan is to moderate our discussion for about 40 minutes or so. But I think part of the value of these panels is the opportunity for you all to ask questions. This is a pretty relaxed environment. We want that to be the case. We want you to feel open and willing to ask questions in the remaining 20 minutes for the Q&A. So as you're listening and hearing from our political experts, think about the type of questions that you'd be interested in because they really have a wealth of knowledge that they can impart onto you. So to my left, Danielle Cendejas, thank you so much for being here today. Longtime political strategist with experience in political campaigns and progressive causes, including being a field organizer for the Obama campaign in 2007, 2008. She joined the Strategy Group, which is a political consulting firm in 2009 and is a senior vice president specializing in direct mail campaigns and has worked with the mayor's office and congressmen, actually a whole bevy of clients. So we'll hopefully dive into a little bit of that and learn what that experience is all about. She's also works and conducts candidate training programs for organizations like Emerge America, Emerge California, and the like. To her left is Serapia Kim, who is the Central Area Representative for Mayor Eric Garcetti, serving Koreatown, downtown LA, and Hollywood, where she builds relationships with neighborhood councils, nonprofit organizations, and groups, volunteer groups such as that. She previously worked as a field representative for California Assembly member Miguel Santiago of the 53rd District and is currently a board member on the Korean American Democratic Committee, as well as other things. I have literally hit the tops of the trees with our two panelists, but the first question that I always like to ask, and I'll just start with Danielle if that's okay. Tell us a little bit about the arc of your journey, about where you started and how you got to where you're at, and then we'll do the same for Serapia.
Sure. So I grew up in the LA area. I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, Rosemead to be specific, and I think I first got excited about politics. Like my parents always watched the news. I remember they were very excited about Bill Clinton winning. So like those were sort of early political memories, but I got really into this is what I can do by watching The West Wing. I was a junior in high school when The West Wing came out. And so on live television, on broadcast, we had a VHS system for our youngins who now just can put it on HBO Max, which is also fantastic. But that was like really the first time that I saw someone like people on TV that said, oh, like, I can work for a president. Like that seems really cool. How do I do that? And not knowing how to do that, I just sort of took every opportunity to volunteer that I could. The Gore campaign was Super Tuesday. California was a Super Tuesday state. So I had volunteered to do like it was like a press thing in East LA. We went and knocked on doors for a little bit. And that was like the first exposure of like, ooh, like this is what it's like to volunteer in a presidential campaign. I went away to school. I went to Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, and my freshman year, Al Gore came to campus, and I got to volunteer. I got to be the student speaker at the event. I was a freshman. I was in the Young Democrats, and I was like, oh, this is fun. This is like the adrenaline rush of politics. I'm really excited about it. So throughout my college career, I volunteered on every campaign that I could. I ended up my senior year becoming president of the Young Democrats on my campus. We were in a presidential election in 2004. The Iraq War had just broken out. There was sort of this renewal of interest in politics among college students. And so I just took the opportunity to intern. And then that led to a job on a congressional campaign. And after that congressional campaign, we lost. I was like, well, what do we do? And it really came down to, do I go to DC and try to pursue a career there? Or do I go back home to LA where I had interned for a state senator? Turned out the state senator had a job open that I could have started at the next month. And so that's what I did. I came back to LA, worked for a state senator, similar to what you did working for the assembly member, being a field representative. Then I caught the Obama bug. And when you fall in love with a candidate, like, you do whatever you can to like get that person elected, but also like give up your life to go work on that campaign. And so the advice that I was given was, he's a once in a blue moon candidate. Like, you're going to regret not doing this, so figure out a way to get it done. And so I moved to New Hampshire. And in presidential politics, you either go to Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, or South Carolina. And the difference between Iowa and New Hampshire is Iowa is a caucus state, which is this whole crazy system that hopefully we don't have to do anymore after the last time. And New Hampshire is a primary state. So I ended up in New Hampshire and worked on the presidential campaign there in the primary. Then after the primary was over, they sent me to New Jersey, then I went to Texas, and then I ended up in Chicago working on the delegate tracking team. And so for those who are now presidential historians, because we've been so far away from the 2008 Obama campaign, the delegate team was what mattered, and what ended up winning him, was crucial to winning him the primary, because it became every delegate counted towards getting the nomination at the convention. So I worked on that team. Did convention, ended up in New Mexico. After we won New Mexico, I came back home and I was like, okay, what do I do now? And they called me, they're like, come to DC for 3 weeks, work on the inauguration. So I did that. And DC was cold. I was the talent coordinator for the youth ball. And then after the balls kind of, went, the real work came to be done. And I was like, well, if I'm going to be unemployed and figuring out what my next step is, I'm going to LA where it's warm and we'll wait out the system. And it turned out that year in 2009, the reason why I joined Strategy Group was because Arnold Schwarzenegger had called a special election and they needed somebody to come in and work coordinating their direct mail, organizing all of the various pieces and production aspects and accounting aspects. So when I came back home, I connected with that consultant. Friends had gotten me connected to them, and a month later I was hired, and I haven't left since. I've obviously grown in my role, but that was sort of how I got to this point as a political strategist.
Great. Wow, great history. Serapia.
Wow, how do I even follow up?
Everyone has their own journey.
Exactly.
Really fascinating. It's good to hear that. Well, mine's gonna be much shorter than that, but starting from the way beginning. So I was born in Incheon, South Korea, and then I moved to the US at the age of 9. And I didn't go to USC, unfortunately, but I went to a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts called Williams College. So yeah, making the big trip from LA to the freezing Massachusetts winter. That was quite interesting. So there, I actually started out as a chemistry major, well, chemistry/philosophy. But I've always been interested in politics because my best friend in high school was like super big in politics, and he still is. So I was like, okay, I want to, keep conversing with them, and I want to know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to take one poli-sci class every semester just to keep my, my senses sharp and whatnot. And I realized I'm sure a lot of us kind of go through that reckoning where like we realize that our major is not really for us at some point. And I know a lot of people switch majors. So after a while, I didn't really fit in with the chem route. So I actually just switched over to poli-sci. And then I started taking some econ classes because I was like, okay, if I'm going to understand policy, you probably have to know where the money is, right? Following the money. Yup. So political machines. So I started taking some econ classes and I realized I could actually put them together in a major called political economy. I don't know if we have that at USC or if it's more called like public policy, but it's.
We have political economy.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's like, okay, not every college has this, so I get really excited when there's. Yeah, so I was thinking that. I graduated, I mean, not into the pandemic, it was 2019, but I didn't get any of the consulting gigs that I was applying for, so I was home and just kind of feeling a little bit sad. But then still going out to events in the area because I wanted to be active. So during college, I did a couple internships, like I interned with an assembly member for a couple months, and then I interned with I'm not going to name names, but the council member in the 12th district in the valley who shall not name anymore. Yep, he had an internship program, so I was in that one too. So I was still kind of like involved. So one day I got invited to this like nonprofit like gala ceremony because I think that's what a lot of nonprofit organizations do to kind of promote their work, and also that's like a big fundraising opportunity for them. So I kind of went because it's a Korean American organization, wanted to go and mingle with some folks. Long story short, I met someone there who was like, hey, there's an opening for a field representative position in the assembly member's office. They're looking for a Korean speaker because he covers all of Koreatown, and it's really important to connect with the constituency with the language that they speak. And Koreatown is an ever-growing, large area with the largest Korean American or Koreans outside of Seoul, South Korea. So it's really important that we have someone who speaks the language and knows the history. So I got hired there, and I worked there before pandemic, but really mostly during the pandemic. And I did not realize like how much work the government can do in providing benefits, but connecting people to benefits, only because it is really difficult to go through the application process with all the language barriers, technology barriers. So that's when like local offices like the assembly office can really do pull the leg to be like, hey, these constituents need help, they haven't heard back. So I've been doing a lot of casework during my time there. But after 2 years there, I heard about an opportunity at the mayor's office because there's a lot of high turnover, which is pretty typical of political offices. I think people stay maybe 2 to 3 years and then move on to different positions. So they had an opening for Central Area, which also happens to cover all of Koreatown. But as Professor said, it also covers downtown Hollywood, Echo Park, Silver Lake, areas where, some of the top issues are like homelessness and government assistance that folks need. So I was able to get that position, and here I am, working as a Central Area representative, doing what I can on the side with helping with campaigns, and also being on a board of the only Korean American Democratic committee in the country. So that's been quite interesting to witness as well. So yeah, happy to be here, and thank you for the invite. I'm like really honored to be right next to Danielle for this.
Great, wonderful. Well, it's great to have both of you. I'm going to start with you, Danielle, and talk a little bit, the students in class, they learn a lot of the theoretical aspects of politics. Of course, that's what you would expect. The news educates us for good or bad about the sort of political rancor that's going on, and certainly that's hit all new heights. I wonder what politics looks like in your world in terms of is there, now working at a political consulting firm, presumably you've got clients, most of which are probably on the progressive side, perhaps some of which are moderate, maybe some are even on the conservative side. What role does politics play in your sort of day in and day out life that you work within the strategy group?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think, ultimately, what I see my job is as a political consultant is, we're advertisers. So we're trying to be storytellers. And what we're advertising is either an issue or we're advertising like a person, right? And so what we're ultimately trying to do is get a sense for what is this person's life story? How do we connect it to the issues that matter to that particular community? Why are they going to be a good representative for whatever office they are choosing to run for, whether it's school board all the way to, U.S. Senate, for instance, and then figuring out, from there, what are the dynamics at play, right? And oftentimes you will hear folks that say, oh, ideologically, this person's a progressive and they're from a, progressive district. And so it's like, well, what does that mean? What that means is that there's a lot of people in one particular political party that happen to live in that area, and what their dynamics of, what the numbers look like from a math perspective is more than likely that's going to be a Democrat winning that seat. So the question becomes, does that person actually represent the current makeup of that community, or are they maybe out of touch in a way that they're no longer, they're no longer viable in that, community. So when I'll take, for example, not a race that we worked on, but, if you've watched the Knock Down the House documentary that followed around, I see all the nods of the women in the room, that's great. But they followed a Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and that was a great example of, that's a Democratic district, they're going to elect a Democrat to Congress. Their question in a primary was, which Democrat do we choose? And the way in which she campaigned, she presented herself more connected to the people than her opponent did. And that's ultimately what, helped her overcome that. But it was, she had advertising, she did nail, she did, door-to-door, canvassing, she did a video that got, really popular on social media. And so, ultimately, you're not going to get elected unless you tell people about yourself. And the way we tell people about yourself is, getting in their mailboxes, doing the text messaging, doing the door-to-door. If you have the money and the media market that allows you to do going on broadcast television, being everywhere for the 6 weeks that your voter's mind is on the election, because they're like, oh, it's November, there must be an election going on, and that muscle memory that gets in. So, I think the atmosphere, you'll hear a lot that people are divided and they're, not as, people just don't see eye to eye. I think ultimately, folks, I think, are discovering, because it's easier to get information about where you stand on things, right? So before social media became sort of the medium in which we communicate with one another, it was like, don't talk about politics, don't talk about money, don't talk about religion. And now social media is like, well, we're all talking about politics, we're all weighing in, and we're all giving our hot take on whatever it is. So I think we're seeing people's relationships to each other in a different light. And what we as political, folks need to do is sort of understand, well, where are these attitudes coming from? Where at the root cause are you having this opinion come from? And sometimes it's like, well, my friend shared this thing on Facebook, and so therefore I believe that. And sometimes it's like, oh, well, no, I read the newspaper and that's informing my opinion. So our job is to really kind of get at that root, but also how do we make sure that the candidate or the issue that we're talking about gets connected to that, and what medium is the way that it needs to get in front of as well.
Interesting. Serapia, I wonder, same question, but a different orientation, because of course you work as a field representative, or you have worked as a field rep and as an area rep now in a community that might have some very progressive people, might have some very conservative people, would be my guess, right? And you have to be able to sort of navigate both of those worlds on behalf of the mayor's office, which, Garcetti is certainly a Democrat. How do you sort of walk that fine line? Because, depending on the group you're going to be before, you might have to sort of subtly change your perspective a little bit so that you have open ears that are willing to listen to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so even though we're technically a Democratic office, hardly politics ever, never really quite comes up explicitly as a partisan issue, but it's more like when we have issues like vaccine, equity, or we have issues like homelessness, that's where I can see the dividing line on the types of narratives that come up from progressive grassroots organizations versus organizations that represent businesses. And even though we're all talking about the same issue, I think the job of our office as an area representative and as a public-facing office is to recognize what are the issues at hand, when people are in the same room and they're all getting very animated and very frustrated by different concerns that they have, what exactly is the heart of it, right? So for example, when we look at homelessness, which is, I feel that's the number one issue that comes up at every meeting, every organization, right? There is a side of like, hey, like, during this pandemic, we had a great program called like Project Room Key, which, sees the hotels basically, or not sees, but we made a contractual agreement with the hotels to temporarily house the unhoused, but now that that's phasing out and we're trying to find more permanent solutions such as Project Home Key or even permanent supportive housing, the delay does cause a lot of people to fall through the cracks. And it's like, how do we best support people during this time when the pandemic is still out there and the vaccine rate among the unhoused is still really low? How do we make sure that people get the help that they need? But also, like, how do we make sure that the businesses, for example, are able to operate, and that the folks, who live in areas where there's a high number of encampments, for example, like, how do we make sure that their concerns are also being balanced with the needs of the people? Like, it's such a difficult kind of issue. It's not a monolithic issue at all, and everything really depends on that specific area, right? Really talking to the stakeholders there, talking to community organizers, talking to even LAPD, and seeing like what can we really do on those issues. So politics kind of comes out in differing opinions that way, but I think the role of our office is to like really make sure that we focus on the needs, right? Because behind every politicized issue is an unmet need of the community. And like our job is to like recognize that and always try to connect people to the right resources. Because the mayor's office, I realized we have like 340 staff, which is such a jump from my previous assembly staff, which only had like 20 people. So with that big of a scope comes more resources, but it also comes like a lot of these bureaucratic kind of institutional procedures that I, as an employee, like I'm the one tasked with navigating that. And even on my end, it can be a little bit difficult because
that was the very next question I was going to have for you, which is I don't think
Yeah.
most of the students in the class know what it's like to work in a big bureaucracy, which is certainly different from political consulting, and we'll give you a chance to sort of talk about that. But so it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you are at some level a middleman, right, in between the people and the mayor's office, and you're helping, transmit some of their messaging to the mayor's office to hopefully deal with issues of homelessness or whatever it is.
Yeah.
What does that process really look like? I mean, when in terms of the sausage making, in terms of actually talking to people who have a significant issue, vaccine programs, whatever it is, to going to the mayor's office, how do things actually get accomplished in such a large bureaucracy with 340 employees or whatever you mentioned there?
Yeah.
Can you lay that out a little bit? Not overly specific, but give a sense of what your role is in terms of transmitting that message.
Yeah, of course. So I'm just one person representing an area with hundreds of thousands of people. So it really helps when there are community organizers already out there. So LA City has a system called neighborhood councils, where each neighborhood gets to elect its own board members, and they get to meet probably once a month. And a lot of representatives from elected officials' offices go attend those meetings to hear the needs of the community in that direct way. So a lot of the concerns do get to me that way. So if a neighborhood council, it's like, hey, I'm telling them, hey, your vaccine rate is pretty low, it's like 59%, which is below city average. Then I would go up to our office and see what the procedure is for working with like clinics or for other nonprofit organizations like CORE, which has been really big in the LA city and county community. And then we work out a location, working with, say, LA FD, which kind of, even though they're a firefighting agency, they help with like street, reservations and things like that. So yeah, a lot of that is institutional knowledge. So we really rely on people who've been in the office for many years, but there's usually a strict procedure on like which people that we talk to get the city permits and the location, and make sure that the organizations are aware of it. So yeah, as you said, basically middle person in taking concerns from the community, and then finding the appropriate personnel to talk to make something happen.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great to see the way that operates. Danielle, I want to just jump back for a second to your time with Obama.
Mhm.
Obviously, that was a political time, but I think a different political time, right? Not quite as much in terms of tribalism, I don't think, from what we've seen today.
Right.
So how has, at least based on your experience from your time with the Obama campaign up until the present time, how have you seen politics change, or have you? Has this sort of tribalism attitude always been in place, or do you think it is sort of ratcheted up over time?
I think it feels more intense now because you log on to Twitter and it's like, what's trending? Did somebody do something right? And I think, if we look at the last 4 years, I think a lot of us have been conditioned to like, oh, is the sky falling? Are we going to be okay? Right. And I think what has really changed is when we were talking on the Obama campaign, one of the things that the president really dug into about why he wanted to do healthcare reform was because his mom was worried about how she was going to pay her bills while she was dying of ovarian cancer. And if you've ever been through a situation where you feel like the healthcare system is failing you, you understand that story. And so for him, that mission driven of, there was a lot of noise, I think in 2009, 2010, when, every member of Congress went home to do a town hall around healthcare, and stories were like, people are coming to these town halls and they're like calling themselves this Tea Party movement and they're doing that sort of thing. The intensity was there. A lot of us weren't on social media back then, and so it was, Twitter was still in its infancy. Facebook was still very much a like college, high school, young adults only, space. Instagram was not even a thing then, right. So you really were relying on those traditional media sources, like giving you that information about how intense those fights were, but they were intense. And there was a lot of reports of, folks like, members of Congress feeling like, oh, is this safe enough for me to do a town hall? So, so that intensity, I think, around, you can look in history of various campaigns of how the intensity back and forth mudslinging happened. It just all happened in pen and paper and traditional press. So I don't think it necessarily has gotten, lessened, or, I don't think it's more intense than it was before. It just feels more intense because we are in an environment where there's news all the time. People are instantly knowledgeable of stuff that is happening. And, and then it's sort of like what gets distilled into that 30-minute nightly news story on ABC, which is the most watched news story in America. What is David you're talking about that night? Well, half of us have already known that because it was on Twitter this morning, right? So I think that's kind of how we're interacting and engaged with politics feels like it's more surrounding us because of just where we're getting our information.
Serapia, similar question in the sense that you have to engage with a lot of the public. Do you ever get put in a position where people in the public start coming at you because you're a representative of the mayor and maybe they're not a big fan? And if so, how do you bridge that gap? How do you work at keeping avenues open so people will listen to the messaging that you're sending and receiving from them?
Yeah, it's always really tough. So there was an event last Monday. LA City had a really historic moment where we had a grand opening ceremony, or a ribbon cutting ceremony of our first civil rights department called Civil and Human Rights and Equity Department, which is going to be the new hub for all files of discrimination and harassment and around the city. And that really came about because of voices like BLM and other organizations that really showed pre-existing issues, right? The issue of discrimination has always been around, but I think it really amplified. So the city listened, and then we hastened the opening of the ceremony. But we were then met with protesters during the opening, where people were visibly, emotionally very frustrated at homelessness and how it's growing, and the services seem to not be reaching the people that they need. And although it wasn't explicitly about the opening of our department itself, it is still an issue that the city has responsibility for and has tried really hard to connect people to resources to. So when things like that happen, where it's okay, we're really met with face-to-face with protesters, and we're kind of met with this visceral kind of display of civic frustration and all of that. I think that's when it's most clear to me, the impact and the power that we have, but also the great responsibility that comes with it. instead of like kind of shying away from it, we try to lean in, well, not lean in the sense that, but lean into these voices, even though someone may be hypercritical of our administration and of our work. They're still, they're still the people that we represent. Like, we don't just stand for Democrats of Los Angeles. We really stand for everybody across partisan lines and across ideological divides as well. I mean, it does get difficult, but we just have to keep pushing and meeting them on the same level, right? For a lot of these folks, issues of equity are at the forefront. It's like, so hey, like at this moment in time, while we are still working on expanding our programs and building more housing, like what can we do right now to collaborate? And that's when we kind of meet common ground. It's like, hey, like there's vaccine equity, there's like, food distribution, like food bank sites. And it is in those areas that we can kind of meet face to face and like collaborate, even in a very like kind of heated environment otherwise, right? And we see the function of these like very hypercritical voices as well. Like, we need people from all across the aisle. We need people to hold us accountable and like to inform the people when some program or some service is not working as intended. And even though it kind of like hurts a little bit on a personal level, like that's what, that's the function of social media, and that's the function of raising our public voices, whether at like city councils or on Twitter. We see a lot of tweets at Mayor of LA. So we really do read those and see those, and all the emails that we get, and sometimes letters too. People still do send us letters. So yeah, we read them. We really do as a staff do consider them, and it does get to the people on top. Like, it does come up in topics of conversation.
Right. I will say, let's add on to that. I mean, a lot of times, like, Twitter's not real life, right? Like, it's not a great representative of a focus group. And so we have to remind ourselves that just because we're hyper connected doesn't mean the folks that we're looking to represent or our candidates looking to represent are necessarily in that. So I always try to let an elected or a candidate know, like, you're governing for the folks who are at home, right? Like, you're governing for the people who are in their living room, just trying to pay their bills. They're trying to put food on the table. They're trying to get their kids to sleep. And they the only thing they want to do is like stream Ted Lasso tonight because the next morning's going to be hard, right? And so those are the people we have to remember are part of this conversation too. And they might not always be the loudest voices, and they might not always be the people who are in our faces, but they're the ones who are, really like the beneficiaries of what we do on a day-to-day basis too. And I think that perspective is one that I have, tried to comfort electeds who are like, oh, I got yelled at this city council meeting. It's like, it's okay, because
everyone gets yelled at every city council meeting.
There's 20 people in the room, there's 20,000 people at home. Let's balance out let's let the cooler heads prevail here.
Great.
On that note, it's like sometimes like really consequential issues don't really get any coverage at all. Like, for example, not to promote a little bit, but I'm promoting a little bit. It's an important service. So we have a new service called Angelina Connect that provides fee-free banking services as well as debit cards to people, which is huge. Where a lot of people rely on things like payday loans, right, to make their ends meet. Like, this would be really great access to them, but it's not something that's like, all over Twitter, like, oh, look at this.
Not real sexy.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
I want to shift gears just a little bit before we open it up to the class, and I'll start with Serapia, if I might. If it wasn't too long ago that you were a college student, right? Not too many years out, few, but not too many. What advice can you give for what they should be either doing or thinking about at this stage of their careers? Most of the students in this class are sophomores, juniors, some seniors, people who are thinking about going into politics, particularly in elected office. What should their focus be before they jump out into that job market?
Yeah, so I'm sure y'all have heard this a lot, but internships really do help. I only interned for like 2 months, I think, for this assembly office, but that came up in my interview a couple times where it's like, hey, I see that you already worked for an assembly office before. Like, hey, what do you think about that? So that's like a really good connection, a good way to show an employer that you have harbored this interest, even if it's just one. You don't have to do something like the same thing for all 4 years. It's actually great if you do switch around and explore their fields as well, of like banking industry, nonprofit, something out left field. I know USC offers like a great support where you can get your unpaid internship funded, which is awesome. So yeah, just go out there, intern, or even like volunteer for campaigns. I don't know if everybody has canvassed here before, but canvassing is a really great way to kind of connect with voters and see like what it's like on the ground. Like the first time that I canvassed was for Bernie Sanders. That was very fun, very exciting. And then I went more local and then canvassed for Lori Lundquist, who's running for city council in my district. And that was completely, well, not completely, but very different in terms of like scope, right? Federal versus city. So that was quite interesting to see as well. But no one's gonna come up to you like, especially in COVID, and be like, hey, like, can you please like volunteer for us? Like, you have to be in those spaces where people are going out there, whether it's like protesting or having meetings like at neighborhood councils, like just kind of put yourself out there, even if you aren't like sure like what's going on and like you don't really know anyone in the group. No one's gonna be like, oh, what is that person doing here? Like, that's weird. It's like, no, it's not like that at all. Just go out there and then just see what happens. Because like, I wouldn't have gotten my job, for example, if I just didn't see what happened when I went to that little gala. So yeah, just really meet with people and connect.
Great. Danielle, one of the questions that students
Been
often
a
ask.
little longer since I was in college.
Well, yeah, but the one question I always get with regard to your field in particular is, do you have to have experience in a campaign in order to be a political consultant? I mean, logically, it makes sense.
Right.
It's almost like putting the cart before the horse. If
Right.
I'd be curious as to your viewpoints as to the best path for success to enter into consulting.
Yeah, so I think it is really hard to tell. One, we run a business, right? So candidates hire us or organizations hire us to pass their ballot measures or their issue campaigns because they feel like we have a level of expertise that we offer, right? So there's a lot of learning to be involved, whether that's you start at a very entry-level position at a consulting firm and you've seen a lot of campaigns and you've been there for a while and you grow up basically with the firm. Like, that is one way, to do it, because you're essentially like becoming ingrained in the operations and you understand how the bills get paid, you understand the business side and aspect of it. So, your expertise comes with the experience that you've been with that particular firm. The other way to do that is also just work on a bunch of campaigns and and diversify that experience so that there's not one campaign that like you've done congressional races, you've done Senate races, you've done gubernatorial races, you've done a presidential. Okay, great. Now you've got an expertise and a relationship base so that somebody will hire you and say, okay, we want you to do this scope of work and we're going to hire you to do, like, you're an expert at digital, advertising. We're going to hire you and give you money so you can run all of our digital campaigns. Now you've got a business that you're building, right? So it's figuring out do you have enough experience and relationships to create a book of business that you can sustain yourself and pay yourself, and make sure that if you have people who are working underneath you, that you can also make sure they get paid, they're getting paid a fair wage, they're getting a good salary and all of those sorts of things. But I think people forget that political consulting is, it's part mission driven and part, inspiration, but it's also like we've got to eat. We've got bills to pay, we've got offices to maintain, we got staff to make sure that they're in there. So it is like, there's no one right way to get into it, but again, internships, that campaign experience, but it is like, I think it's hard to tell a candidate, okay, I know exactly what to do and how to set up your campaign if you haven't sat in the office and made phone calls for like 40 hours, right? Like, if you've never helped raise money for a candidate, it's hard for you to say, oh, I can do all your fundraising, I can handle this for you. Like, there's a lot of technical things that you need to build over time, and the way we do that is through experience. Now, I will say, a lot of campaigns, you walk into their headquarters and they're run by 20-somethings. It's an industry where you can, at a very young age, all of a sudden be given the opportunity to manage a multi-million-dollar campaign and tell consultants, like, this is what I need you to do. But to get there, you really do have to put in the legwork and work on campaign after campaign after campaign to get there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. All right, final question for the two of you before our students ask some enlightening questions. I'll start, same question, but I'll start with Serapia. What is the one thing you know now that you wish you had known when you were graduating from college in order to be more successful in your job? What is that sort of nugget, the takeaway that you can give to the students in terms of helping them out with their sort of ultimate success in this field of politics? Anything that comes to mind?
I would say you're going to be asked to do something that you've never really done before a lot. Whether you're a field representative or working for a campaign or things like that, people are going to look at you. It's like, okay, you're 20 something, you probably know all about like, you know, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, whatnot. It's like, hey, can you design this? Like, can you translate that? Hey, can you write up a blurb for this? And it's like, okay, in my mind, I'm like, I've never done that before. I guess I know how to use Canva, but I've never done it before. I'm like, sure, you know what? I'll say yes. And then I just like, you know, go and researching. Because the thing is like people in these positions, like district director, chief of staff, they've been here for decades and they know how to read people. And like when you were hired or you're recruited as a volunteer, it's not for nothing. They saw something in you, right? They saw potential, they saw enthusiasm. And like half the time enthusiasm and just saying yes will carry you all the way there. And you can always ask questions. That's the thing. Like I've always been very a little bit shy about asking questions at first. So I was like, I don't want to be like bothering people, but it's like they're there for a reason, right? And people are more than happy to empower you, like pass on the knowledge, like things that they wish they knew. So really rely on that, the people around you, and just say yes to things and see what happens.
Great, great word of wisdom. Danielle, how about you?
What she said. Model employee right here. That's exactly what we look for. We want somebody who's going to figure it out. We want somebody who's going to take that initiative. And if you get stuck, it's okay to ask questions, you know, but really kind of get there. I think the thing that I wish I would have known, and it's something that I've learned over time, is like the relationships matter in this business. Like you will come across people that you've met when you were in college in a room like this, and 10 years from now, you're like all of a sudden in a, you know, position where you're like, oh, like I need to, you know, we're talking about like you coming to work for me, or we're talking about you hiring me to be running your campaign. Like there are, the world of politics is super, super small, even if it doesn't feel like it's that small, and everybody knows each other. And so really kind of you know, valuing those relationships, keeping in touch with people. I have like a 350 person, you know, Christmas card list that I send to people who, you know, just because you never know when people are going to come in and out of your life. But at any given point, even just like I was talking about the DNC convention earlier, that's like a big family reunion for people in politics. It's like folks who, you know, over time, you might have worked with them in 2004 and it's, you know, 2016 and you're like giving each other a hug because you walk in the hallway and you're like, oh my God, you know, it's good to see you. And so, but for me, it's like, yeah, the looking back on, you know, the 20 some odd years I've been doing this, it's the relationships are key, and keeping in touch with people. And that really is what makes the difference in this business.
Great comments from both of you. I do want to turn it over to the class now. You got a chance to listen a little bit. Maybe just give your name and we'll start in the back there. Just your name, what you're studying, and then question who you'd like.
Hi, I'm Keisha. I'm a senior studying science. Sorry, Danielle, I actually looked it from LinkedIn. I've always like mutual connections.
Nice.
So politics really is like super small.
You should link in me so we could.
I don't really show me, it just didn't pass enough. But so I currently work at the company Higher Labs,
Nice.
which is a venture fund. And so I was wondering, I graduate pretty soon, and I'm looking at country elections and wondering if I should, you know, be on the field and organize. But there aren't any candidates I'm particularly excited about or feeling motivated to work for them in specific. And so I'm not sure if the field organizer role is something that's empowering them on its own, or if it's really like a candidate that makes it. Or what are your thoughts as somebody who's been a field organizer?
Yeah, it's certainly easier to work on a campaign. It's hard work, right? It's low paying. It's like, we joke that being a field organizer is about like, there's a book that was like 90 worst jobs that you can have, and like 15 of them are like components of like the field organizer positions, of like door-to-door advertiser, like, you know, telemarketer. It's like, oh, that stuff is political organizing. You know, sign waiver, like sometimes you do that. You know, so it is certainly, if you're going to pack up your life and move across the country, you want to make sure like you love the candidate. We all don't get to fall in love with the candidate. Sometimes it's a mission driven, right? Like if you're, you know, hyped up about the midterms and you care about a policy, like the midterm elections are going to make or break what Congress is able to do in the next, you know, 2 cycles. So maybe it's, you know, you're not working for specific candidate, but you're signing up to be an organizer for an organization that is pushing the issue you care about, right? Like if you care about climate, maybe you go work on a climate initiative or climate, organization that's pushing candidates so that your day-to-day life is mission driven and it's not necessarily ride or die with that campaign. That being said, campaigns usually last like 6 months max, like when they're able to afford, so it's not forever. People are usually pretty forgiving about a candidate, like on your resume, if they, you're like, oh, I worked for a candidate, but they lost. We all know, we're like, oh, like 2014, that was a terrible year for Democrats. Like, of course you lost, like, everybody did, and so don't feel like you're putting yourself in a box because you're happen to be working for a candidate that you may be like 80% in love with or 70% good with, because ultimately that's experience and it's going to lead you to the next thing. And it will be, once election day hits, you regroup during the holidays and then you start like finding what you're going to do next. And so
Great.
Hopefully that was helpful.
Good question. Other questions? Come on, brave souls. Yes, sir.
For Serapia, first off, I'm Coleman. I go by Cole. I'm a public policy freshman, thinking about adding philosophy too. And then there's questions for Serapia. Also, I'm actually like your intern. Nice to meet you. But I think although I'm like a freshman, some stuff we've been looking into in my classes are kind of the decline in trust in government and people working in government and just the government as an entity. Just over time, there's been a decrease in trust in it. Working kind of like as a representative for Central LA and working in a particularly bipartisan office because, well, city government. What do you like? I feel like civic engagement right now in any city is like kind of declining. And even if you look at the recall election, the voting percentage was like ridiculously low. I don't remember it. What do you think we can do to promote civic engagement across like all backgrounds, all people?
Yeah, so a little self-promo as well with the office, but the mayor has realized that like civic engagement really starts young, right? Like in high school level, even we take government 101 or APUSH specifically for those who lived through that. So for one thing that Garcetti has done to promote civic engagement among students, because students are often the ones who kind of like listen into their parents and are able to have a kind of perspective on that. We have a thing called a program called Mayor's Youth Council, which is for high school students throughout the city of LA. We recruit them from all around the city to have this year-long program where we have workshop sessions with them, but we also empower them to create like a project with an issue of their own. It's like really amazing what kind of issues that students like observe from their day-to-day life. So some past projects that people have done is like, for example, one is on period poverty and how a lot of like period products are not really available at like public schools. So they were the ones that were like looking into resources and then advocating for schools to provide that for free to their students. And some of it actually happened, which is really great. And another thing is about like mental health, as well as like immigration, how our undocumented students like, surviving and how do we help them thrive in the school system. So there are a lot of issues that people from even really young students like have an idea of, but I think it's really the role of this government to be like, hey, these are the resources that you can tap into. Like you can actually just like cold email some organizations and get a response and learn about it. But like people wouldn't know about that unless we have like a structure like the Mayor's Youth Council or other ways in which we put ourselves out there. And that's why I think area representatives and field representatives are so important, because you really are like the walking office. Like you are the one that represents the member, and it's important for like us to be out there and promoting these things, because people are not going to be like checking Twitter all the time. It's like, oh hey, there's a new Angelino Connect program, that's cool. Like no, we have to be blasting social media, we have to be going to these meetings and like constantly promoting it so that people have access to it when they need it, because we realized during the pandemic, like when people need government the most is when they're struggling, right? But it's like when you're at the height of the stress, it's like really difficult to, find resources, let alone apply to things. And that's when we really come in and try to identify the need and then partner with specific stakeholders that already have established relationship with the community. Like a lot of these nonprofits have been working with them for decades. and have this deep trust with them, unlike political offices which may change rather quickly. So I think a lot of it is about like us going out and then like constantly promoting it so that at least one person who may need it can find it.
Great comments. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi there, I'm Will Chambers, I'm a junior study philosophy, politics, and law here. How do the two, and three, if you'd like to offer from a legal standpoint, feel about obstructionism from local to state to federal governments? One, is it necessary? Two, is it useful? Three, what can be done about it?
Who wants to tackle that?
In what context are you talking about obstructionism?
Obstructionism as far as, is there ever a political need to engage in obstruction of bad policy, bad messaging, etc.? Can it be useful in promoting the goods, or should people only focus on doing the things they want to do as opposed to preventing the things that they don't want to happen from other people?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in political campaigns, there are winners and losers, right? And your end goal may be preventing somebody from getting into office because maybe they're not the right fit, right? We live in this Democrat on Democrat environment in California where there's a lot, because of our top two primary, there's a lot of elections that become like, there's two Democrats on the ballot. How do you decipher between one of them? And sometimes we're asked to run a campaign if this candidate is ideologically moderate and this one is more progressive. And so we want the more progressive person. So figure out a way to block the moderate from winning. And so there's research that goes into that. We, do a lot of negative campaigns. We figure out like, what is the best strategy to, to do that. So sometimes that, is the case. That happens, I think, in legislation all the time, right? There's backroom deals that get done of like, we can't let this issue become the light of day because it's going to be bad for so-and-so's future, or it's going to be bad for the state of California, or we can't do this without doing this. And so that, I think, is ultimately like, it's sort of who are in those rooms, who gets to be those decision makers, how does that get made? And so, but there is sort of a reality of, how does this impact, all of these various pieces, right? And every entity has somebody who's advocating for them, right? So like we had a candidate who has been dealing with, is on a committee that deals with a lot of the energy situations. And when the fires came out, there's groups out there who were like, make the whole thing a public utility. In theory, sure, that sounds like a great idea, but here's all the things it would need to take. You would displace like hundreds of thousands of jobs. So now the labor unions come to the table and say, you can't take these jobs away. So what do? If you're going to do this, you need to be mindful of this. And then you've got businesses that come in and say, well, we've got, 10,000 jobs and millions of dollars in assets and X, Y, and Z in the stock market. What are you going to do about shareholders? Here, the X amount of Californians are going to be burned. So like you can come to the idea that says, here's the simple solution that's going to solve everything. And then you start looking at, okay, how complicated is this? Does, this group actually do this? And so when like all of that stuff happens before it even hits the news and before it even becomes an issue, right? Before it's even heard in a hearing. So I think.
Do you see a future then where that sort of finagling is not necessary? I guess might be a better question.
I think deals are always going to be made, right? You come with a proposal and, and I think we're seeing this, the White House is doing this with the infrastructure bill, right? They come to the, Congress and say, this is the package, this is what we want. The Senate is saying, no, yes, yes. Okay, we're done here. The House is saying, yeah, this is acceptable, this is not, we're gonna say no. And I think, based on my Twitter feed, there has been some back and forth today on that particular legislation of like, well, we're yes or no. So I doubt that there is ever a sense of like, White House is gonna send a bill to Congress, Congress just says yes, like everyone's on the same page, because that's not how our system's designed. Like we have in America, we have a system that is, with these checks and balances and, and sort of disagreement and is built into the system. And I don't necessarily, I think there's some things that are like no brainer, this should go through and nobody should, nobody should object to it. But like those issues I think are few and far between because everybody has like a different perspective of what they're trying to bring through. And that's why it's so complicated to get something passed.
Serapia, do you have any thoughts on how to effectively deal with people trying to bring down the mayor's office or their policies or their issues they're trying to promote?
Yeah, so I just got to the mayor's office, so I think I have a little bit more policy experience, like with on the state side. But I mean, with the state of California being very blue still, I think there is still a lot of like internal debate on how to like best solve issues like, you know, housing crisis and everything, you know, complicated zoning laws throughout the state. And honestly, I think like even on like the broadest surface, like we agree like, hey, let's build more housing. Like that was always in the details. And I do see legislators and their staff going back and forth on like the tiniest of details, right? And I think that's where sometimes like we get stuck on, and then a lot of emails and calls and all that are exchanged. But I think there is a level of which, as you said, like it's necessary to really flesh out even the smallest details of policies like that, like how to rezone, like how much to allocate to certain amount of housing, things like that, because it does really trickle down, and well, not trickle down in that way again, but like it does really trickle down to the local level, and it dictates like what we can and cannot do on a local level as well. So I think even if it seems kind of pointless to be arguing about like, you know, 10 versus 20 of whatever thing, it does matter to the legislator, and it does matter ultimately when it comes time to make the big decision. So, I mean, that's what I've been observing, but I'm sure it's a lot different in other states that are much more divided politically. We're lucky that we're pretty political.
Right. I see we're up against the hour, so I want to thank both of our panelists for being here today. Can we please give them a round of applause?